You are standing in a garden. Not a modern garden, not the carefully curated suburban patch with its raised beds of heritage tomatoes and its Pinterest-optimized arrangement of decorative kale. Not the industrial agricultural field with its GPS-guided tractors and its single crop stretching to the horizon in the specific monoculture that the modern food system has decided is efficient. A medieval garden, specifically the kitchen garden of a moderately prosperous English manor in approximately the year 1300, and you are standing in it in early autumn, surrounded by plants that you probably cannot identify. This is the problem. The modern person who considers themselves reasonably well informed about food, who shops at farmers markets, who reads about nutrition, who has opinions about heirloom varieties, would stand in a medieval kitchen garden and recognize, at best, perhaps a third of what they were looking at. The rest would be unfamiliar, not because the plants are rare or exotic in any absolute sense, but because the specific relationship between the medieval European diet and its vegetable component was organized around a completely different set of priorities, preferences, and available varieties than the relationship that the modern food culture has produced. The vegetables that the medieval world grew, ate, valued, and organized significant portions of its agricultural effort around were not the vegetables that the modern supermarket sells. Some of them have disappeared entirely from cultivation. Some of them survive in specialist seed catalogs as curiosities for the historically adventurous gardener. Some of them are still grown in remote corners of Europe, where the agricultural modernization of the 20th century arrived late and stayed incomplete. And some of them, in what is perhaps the most interesting part of the story, are currently being rediscovered by chefs and food scientists and agricultural researchers who have realized that the medieval farmer knew some things about feeding people that the modern food system has forgotten. This script is about those vegetables, the forgotten ones, the parsnip's ancient cousin that disappeared from European tables in the 17th century, the root vegetable that fed the medieval poor through every winter for 1,000 years, and that you have almost certainly never tasted, the green that appeared in every medieval recipe collection, and that modern English doesn't even have a common name for, the legume that was the medieval world's most important protein source, and that the modern food system has reduced to a niche product in health food stores. But this script is also about more than vegetables. It is about the agricultural system that produced them, the open field system, the monastery garden, the peasant's toft garden, the Lord's kitchen garden, and about what that system tells us about how medieval people understood their relationship with the land, with food, and with the seasonal cycles that organized their entire existence. And it is about the specific, fascinating, occasionally alarming ways that the medieval diet actually worked, the food combinations, the preservation techniques, the specific nutritional logic of a cuisine organized around foods that the modern palate would find challenging, and that the medieval body was apparently doing quite well with, until the specific catastrophes of the 14th century demonstrated some of the system's vulnerabilities in ways that the subsequent centuries spent trying to correct. Let's start in the garden. We are, after all, already standing in it. Chapter 1. The garden itself, the physical reality of medieval food, production, and why it looked nothing like the modern farm. The garden you are standing in is smaller than you expected. This is the first surprise of the medieval kitchen garden. The scale. The image of medieval agriculture tends toward the vast, the great open fields of the manorial system stretching to the horizon, divided into the strips that the communal agricultural organization allocated to each household. Those fields existed, and they were central to the medieval food system. But the kitchen garden, the hortus, or herbarium, or toft garden that every household, from the peasant's cottage to the lord's manor, maintained adjacent to the dwelling, was a small, intensive, hand-worked space whose relationship to the open field was the relationship of the intensive and the extensive, the concentrated and the spread. The typical peasant's kitchen garden, the toft, the enclosed plot that the peasant's tenement included alongside the house, was approximately a quarter acre to half an acre, depending on the region and the specific terms of the holding. This was not a large space. It was the space that one or two people, working in the margins of the other agricultural demands of the year, could intensively cultivate with hand tools. The spade, the hoe, the fork, without the animal traction that the open field cultivation required. In this small space, the medieval household grew the majority of the vegetables and herbs that their diet contained. Not the grain. The grain came from the open field strips, the communal agricultural system, organized around the heavy plow and the rotation of the fields. Not the meat. The meat came from the animals that grazed the common pasture or that were kept in the household's small enclosure, but the vegetables, the herbs, the legumes, the root crops that provided the nutritional variety and the specific flavors of the daily diet. These came from the kitchen garden, grown with the intensive attention of people whose nutrition depended on the garden's productivity. The intensiveness of the medieval kitchen garden was genuine. The hand cultivation of a quarter-acre plot with the regular addition of the household's organic waste, the kitchen scraps, the animal, manure, the ash from the fire, to the soil produced a fertility level that the open fields, with their less intensive management, did not match. The archaeological analysis of medieval garden soils, the dark, organic-rich deposits that the kitchen garden's long cultivation produced, reveals a soil quality that the open field's plow-based cultivation system could not achieve, and a corresponding productivity that the medieval garden's intensive management justified. The layout of the medieval kitchen garden was organized around the practical requirements of intensive hand cultivation and the specific plant communities that the medieval agricultural tradition had identified as most productive in this context. The raised beds, rectangular or square plots of enriched soil, elevated slightly above the paths between them, were the standard cultivation unit of the medieval kitchen garden, providing the good drainage and the concentrated fertility that the intensive vegetable cultivation required. The raised bed was not a modern invention. It was the standard cultivation technology of the medieval garden, documented in the agricultural treatises of the period, depicted in the manuscript illustrations and the tapestries that show the garden as a regular feature of the prosperous household's landscape, and surviving in the archaeological record as the soil patterns that the careful excavation of medieval garden sites reveals. The specific dimensions of the medieval raised bed, typically about 1.5 meters wide, the width that allowed the gardener to reach the center from either side without stepping on the cultivated soil, were the ergonomic solution to the specific problem of intensive hand cultivation that every gardener who works with raised beds has rediscovered independently. The monastery garden was the medieval garden in its most developed and most documented form, and it is through the monastery's records, the garden plans, the plant lists, the accounts of what was grown and how it was used, that the modern historian has the best access to the detailed reality of medieval vegetable cultivation. The plan of the St. Gall, the approximately 820 AD architectural drawing of an idealized Benedictine monastery that is one of the most extraordinary documents of the early medieval period, includes a detailed garden plan showing the specific plants to be grown in the monastery's vegetable garden, the physics garden for medicinal plants, and the orchard. The vegetable garden in the St. Gall plan contains 18 raised beds, each labeled with the plant to be grown in it. The plants listed include some that the modern reader will recognize immediately: lettuce, onions, garlic, parsley, coriander, dill, and others that require explanation. Costmary, a herb whose use in medieval cuisine was significant and whose presence in the modern kitchen is essentially absent. Savory, the herb that the medieval cook used, where the modern cook might use thyme or oregano, and that was considered as essential to the medieval kitchen as salt. Fenugreek, the seed-producing legume that appears in the St. Gall plan as a standard garden plant, and that the modern Western cook encounters primarily in Indian cuisine. Lovage, the giant celery-flavored herb that was one of the most important flavoring plants of the medieval kitchen, and that has virtually disappeared from modern European cuisine. The monastery garden also included the physic garden, the medicinal plant garden that was organized around the specific plants that the monastery's infirmarian used for the treatment of the sick. The line between the kitchen garden and the physic garden was, in the medieval understanding, less sharp than the modern distinction between food and medicine would suggest, because the medieval dietary theory, organized around the humoral framework that classified every food by its specific qualities of hot, cold, moist, and dry, treated food as medicine, and medicine as food in ways that made the practical distinction between the two gardens more organizational than conceptual. The open field system that produced the grain was organized around a completely different set of plants and practices from the kitchen garden, and understanding the relationship between the two is essential to understanding the medieval diet as a whole. The open fields grew the cereal crops, the wheat, the rye, the barley, the oats, the mixed grain crops like maslin that provided the bread, and the ale, and the pottage base that were the caloric foundation of the medieval diet. The field crops also included the legumes that the rotation system required for soil fertility, the peas and beans that were planted in the fallow year to fix nitrogen, and that were also an important food crop. The specific rotation systems of the medieval open field, the 2-field and 3-field rotations that organized the annual planting cycle, were not just agricultural management, they were nutritional management, ensuring that the diversity of crops that the field system produced covered the range of caloric and nutritional needs that the diet required. The 3-field system, 1 field in winter grain, 1 in spring grain or legumes, 1 in fallow, produced a crop mix that included the cereal grains and the protein-providing legumes in quantities that reflected the dietary importance of both. The gardens of the great households, the Lord's kitchen garden, the bishop's garden, the wealthy merchant's enclosed garden, were larger and more elaborate than the peasant's toft, with more variety, more exotic plants obtained through the trade networks that the great household's resources could access, and more of the specifically ornamental plants whose combination of beauty and utility was the aesthetic ideal of the medieval garden. The hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden of the medieval aristocratic tradition, the garden whose walls created the specific, protected private space that the medieval aesthetic valued, was both a real garden and a powerful symbol. The garden as paradise, as the ordered beauty of the created world within the walls that kept the wilderness outside. The enclosed garden appeared in literature and in art as the setting for the romantic encounter, the contemplative withdrawal, the specific pleasures of the cultivated, as opposed to the wild. But even the great household's elaborate garden was primarily a food-producing enterprise in the practical reality of its management, whatever the aesthetic and symbolic dimensions it also carried. The beauty of the medieval garden was the beauty of productive plants, of the bee-attracting herbs, the berry-bearing shrubs, the fragrant flowers that were also medicinal plants and culinary ingredients, rather than the beauty of the purely ornamental that the modern garden aesthetic has made its primary standard. Chapter 2. The root vegetables, the underground foundation of the medieval diet. Let's get underground. The root vegetables were the foundation of the medieval poor person's diet in a way that the modern food culture, which treats root vegetables as a side dish, as the less glamorous accompaniment to the protein that is the meal's real subject, does not quite recognize. For the majority of the medieval European population, the root vegetables were not the side dish. They were the main event, the caloric core of the winter diet, the specific food that stood between the household and starvation in the months when the grain stores were running low and the spring's fresh food was still weeks away. And the root vegetables of the medieval world were not the root vegetables of the modern supermarket. The parsnip, Pastinaca sativa, was the most important root vegetable of the medieval European diet, and it is the first and most significant of the forgotten vegetables in the sense that its current status as a minor accompaniment to the Sunday roast represents a dramatic demotion from the central position it occupied in medieval nutrition. The parsnip was the potato of the medieval world, the starchy, caloric, storable root crop that the average household depended on to get through the winter months, planted in spring and harvested in autumn, stored in the root cellar where the cold preserved them through the months when fresh food was unavailable. The comparison to the potato is instructive because the replacement of the parsnip by the potato in European diets after the Columbian exchange is one of the more remarkable vegetable displacements in culinary history. The potato, introduced to Europe from the Americas in the late 16th century, slowly adopted through the 17th and 18th centuries, and then explosively important in the 19th century when it became the dietary staple of large portions of the European population. Arrejom was better than the parsnip in the specific ways that mattered most in the industrial era. Higher yield per acre, higher caloric density per unit of weight, easier to cook in simple ways. But the parsnip had advantages that the potato replaced rather than improved upon. A natural sweetness that the potato lacked, a complexity of flavor that made it more versatile in the medieval kitchen's range of preparations, and a nutritional profile that the humoral medical tradition of the period valued in specific ways. The medieval cook who had parsnips could make them into the thick pottage that was the everyday meal, the roasted accompaniment to the feast day meat, the specific sweet preparations that the parsnip's natural sugar content made possible, and that the potato's starchier flavor profile did not support in the same way. The sweetness of the parsnip was particularly important in the medieval diet because the medieval access to sweetening agents was significantly more limited than the modern cooks. Sugar was expensive and imported from the Mediterranean and beyond, available to the wealthy and unaffordable for the majority. Honey was the everyday sweetener, but it was a finite resource, limited by the number of hives the household maintained. The natural sweetness of the parsnip, which increases significantly after the first frost, as the cold converts the stored starch to sugar in a process that the medieval cook knew and exploited by storing parsnips in the cold rather than in warm conditions, was a source of sweetness that was free, abundant, and specifically valued. The turnip, Brassica rapa, was the other great root vegetable of the medieval world, and its history is slightly different from the parsnips in ways that are instructive. Unlike the parsnip, which has been significantly displaced from the European diet, the turnip has survived as a recognizable food in modern European, and especially British and Northern European cooking, though in a diminished role relative to its medieval importance. The turnip in the medieval diet was the food of the poor in the most direct and least sentimentalized sense, the crop that the peasant household grew on the most marginal land, that required the least preparation and the least cultivation skill, that provided the basic calories to supplement the grain in the months when the grain was running short. The turnip required no cooking to be edible. It could be eaten raw, grated, or cut, with nothing but the hunger that made everything taste acceptable. And the ease of its cultivation and its tolerance of poor soils made it the specific crop of the specific population for whom the better land was not available. The word turnip in several medieval languages carried class connotations that the modern use of the word, stripped of its social context, doesn't convey. The association between the turnip and the poorest stratum of the medieval social hierarchy was explicit enough to appear in the period's literature and satire, and the person who ate turnips when others ate wheat bread was a person whose social position was visibly communicated by their food, in a way that the medieval social hierarchy used food generally to communicate, but this social stigma obscures the turnip's genuine nutritional value and the genuine skill with which the medieval cook used it. The turnip is not a nutritionally trivial vegetable. It provides vitamin C in quantities that were significant for the winter diet, fiber, and the specific minerals that the grain-heavy medieval diet was otherwise short on. The turnip greens, the leafy tops of the turnip plant, which the modern turnip user often discards, were an important food in their own right, particularly in the spring, when the overwintered turnips were beginning to bolt, and the greens were the first fresh green food available after the winter's preserved and stored diet. The skirret, Siam, Cisarum, is the medieval root vegetable. that has most completely disappeared from modern awareness, and it deserves extended treatment because it was, by the accounts of those who grew it and ate it, genuinely delicious in ways that might have saved it from its eventual disappearance if the potato had not arrived with better yield and better storability to displace it. The skirret was a white-rooted plant of the carrot family, producing clusters of small, sweet, white roots that were eaten boiled or roasted or in the elaborate preparations of the more sophisticated medieval kitchen. The Romans had valued it highly. The Emperor Tiberius is supposed to have demanded skirret as a tribute from Germanic territories along the Rhine, though the source for this claim is somewhat unreliable. And it was a standard garden vegetable throughout the medieval period, grown in kitchen gardens from England to the eastern Mediterranean, and valued for the specific combination of sweetness and starchy substance that made it one of the more versatile root vegetables in the medieval cook's repertoire. The skirret's disappearance from European gardens accelerated through the 17th and 18th centuries, as the potato's higher yield per unit of land made the switch from skirret to potato economically rational for the farmer, and as the growing commercial food economy of the early modern period reduced the diversity of cultivated vegetables by selecting for the crops that traveled best, stored best, and yielded most reliably at scale. The skirret traveled badly. Its multiple small roots were difficult to harvest in bulk and difficult to pack and transport. And in a food economy increasingly organized around volume and efficiency rather than variety and flavor, this made it uncompetitive. There are currently small-scale efforts to revive skirret cultivation in the specialist heritage vegetable movement, and the accounts of those who have grown and eaten the revived skirret consistently describe it as genuinely good, sweeter than parsnip, more interesting than carrot, with a flavor that the descriptions compare variously to parsnip, carrot, and artichoke, without being quite like any of them. If the skirret were introduced to the modern food market as a new vegetable, from an exotic location rather than as a revival of a forgotten medieval crop, it would probably do quite well on its merits. The carrot of the medieval world was not the orange carrot of the modern supermarket. The orange carrot, the variety that selective breeding in the Netherlands in the 17th century produced, and that has since become so dominant that the modern person struggles to imagine carrots being any other color, was not available in the medieval period. The carrots that the medieval cook used were white, yellow, red, and purple. The range of colors that the ancestral carrot populations produced, and that the orange variety subsequently displaced through its combination of sweetness, color stability, and commercial appeal. The purple carrot specifically was common in the medieval garden and in the medieval diet, and its medicinal reputation in the humoral tradition was different from the medicinal reputation of the other carrot colors. The purple pigment, which we now know to be anthocyanins with genuine antioxidant activity, was classified in the humoral framework as having specific warming properties that the lighter colored varieties lacked. The medieval physician who recommended purple carrots for specific conditions was making a recommendation that was theoretically grounded in the wrong framework, but that may have been empirically useful in ways that the right framework can now explain. The beet, Beta vulgaris, was grown in the medieval garden primarily for its leaves rather than its root, and this distinction between the medieval use of the beet and the modern use is one of the more revealing examples of how completely the priorities of vegetable cultivation can change over time. The beet root that the modern cook uses, the large, sweet, dark red root of the modern beet varieties, was a product of selective breeding that developed over centuries, and the medieval beet was a significantly different plant, smaller rooted, with the large, nutritious leaves that were the valued part of the plant in the medieval kitchen. The beet greens of the medieval kitchen were one of the important cooked greens of the spring garden, the first substantial green food available as the garden came back to life after the winter, and the humoral tradition valued them as a warming, loosening food appropriate to the spring season's need to counteract the cold and dryness of winter. The root was used, but primarily as a flavoring or a medicinal ingredient, rather than as the substantial food that the modern beetroot represents. Chapter 3. The brassicas, the cabbage family's medieval forms, and the sion, vegetables that didn't survive. The cabbage is older than you think. The brassica family, the sprawling, genetically flexible plant family that includes cabbage, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, turnips, and mustard, all of them descended from a single wild ancestor that still grows on the chalk cliffs of southern England and the limestone coasts of the Mediterranean, was the most important vegetable family in the medieval European diet, and it was represented in the medieval garden by forms that were both similar to and different from the modern versions that the supermarket sells. The wild cabbage ancestor, Brassica oleracea in its original undomesticated form, was a scraggly, unremarkable plant of coastal cliffs and disturbed ground, with small leaves, a woody stem, and none of the dramatic physical characters of the domesticated forms that selective cultivation has produced over the centuries. The process by which the unremarkable wild ancestor became the cabbage, the kale, the broccoli, the cauliflower, and the Brussels sprout was the process of human selective cultivation extending over approximately 2,000 years, and the medieval forms of the brassica were partway through this process. More developed than the wild ancestor, but less developed than the modern supermarket forms. The kale, or more precisely, the range of loose-leafed brassicas that the medieval world grouped together as coleworts or coleworts, was one of the most important vegetables in the medieval diet across all social levels, and it was a different plant from the curly, tender kale of the modern food culture. The medieval kale was a tougher, more robust plant, tall, often standing a meter or more in height, with large, flat, or slightly crinkled leaves in shades of green that ranged from yellow-green to dark blue-green, depending on the variety and the season. The specific virtue of the medieval kale that made it so central to the winter diet was its hardiness. Kale is the most cold-tolerant of the brassica vegetables, capable of surviving temperatures well below freezing and actually improving in flavor after frost exposure. The cold converts some of the leaf's starches to sugars, producing a sweeter, less bitter flavor in the frost-touched leaves than in the unfrosted summer growth. In the medieval kitchen garden, where the winter months were the period of greatest food scarcity, and where the ability to harvest fresh food from the frozen garden was genuinely valuable, the kale's cold hardiness made it one of the few reliable sources of fresh green food through the winter. The importance of this cannot be overstated in the context of the medieval nutritional situation. The winter diet of the medieval poor was organized around stored and preserved foods, the salted meat, the dried peas and beans, the stored grain, the root vegetables in the cellar, and the specific nutritional deficiencies that this diet produced over the winter months were real and consequential. Vitamin C deficiency, the deficiency that produces scurvy, was a genuine risk of the winter diet, and the kale that could be harvested from the frozen garden in January and February was providing vitamin C in quantities that the stored and preserved foods could not. The colewort, or kale, that appears in the earliest English recipe collections, the Forme of Cury, compiled around 1390, being the most famous, was the backbone of the vegetable sections of these collections, appearing in the pottage recipes that formed the majority of everyday cooking. The standard medieval pottage, the thick, slow-cooked grain and vegetable stew that was the everyday meal of the majority of the population, was primarily a vehicle for coleworts and the other available vegetables, the grain providing the caloric base and the vegetables providing the flavor and the nutritional variety. The specific medieval kale varieties that were grown before the development of the modern curly and Tuscan kale types are largely lost. The selective breeding of the past several centuries has replaced the medieval forms with the modern ones, and the medieval forms survive only in the occasional heritage variety that the specialist seed library preserves. But the descendants of the medieval kale tradition can be seen in the traditional kale varieties of the regions where the agricultural modernization was slowest: the Portuguese couve tronchuda, the Galician grelo, the Tuscan cavolo nero, And in these survivors, the specific characters of the medieval kale tradition are still visible. The tall stem, the robust large leaf, the specific flavor profile of a plant that has not been selected primarily for tenderness and mild flavor. The cauliflower and broccoli of the modern supermarket were not present in the medieval garden of Northern Europe. These vegetables, the result of the selection of specific bud-forming characteristics in the Brassica oleracea population, were developed in the Mediterranean, particularly in Italy, and did not become widely available in Northern European gardens until the 16th and 17th centuries, when the Italian influence on Northern European cuisine and horticulture brought them north. The medieval Englishman or Frenchman or German had never tasted broccoli, had no concept of cauliflower, and was not missing them because the kale and the other available brassicas were filling the nutritional role that the later developing vegetables would eventually occupy. Brussels sprouts, the small, tight-budded individual portions of the Brassica oleracea that the modern child reliably refuses to eat, are a relatively recent development, not appearing in the historical record until the 13th century in Belgium, and not becoming widely cultivated outside the Low Countries until significantly later. The medieval English garden did not include Brussels sprouts, though the Low Countries gardens of the later medieval period were beginning to develop the variety. The mustard, Brassica nigra, and Brassica juncea, was grown in the medieval garden primarily for its seeds, which were the source of the condiment that the medieval kitchen used in quantities that the modern mustard as occasional condiment culture does not quite match. Mustard was one of the most important spices of the medieval kitchen, used in sauces, in meat preparations, in the potages and ragouts of the more elaborate cuisine, and in the medicinal preparations of the monastery's physic garden. The mustard plant's leaves were also eaten, particularly in spring, when the young mustard greens were among the first fresh foods available, and the medieval garden included mustard as much for the leaf as for the seed in the seasons when the leaf was available. The sea kale, Cramba maritima, was a wild vegetable of the Atlantic coasts that the medieval coastal population harvested from the cliff tops and beaches where it grew naturally, and that the monastery gardens and the great household gardens sometimes cultivated in their more elaborate forms. Sea kale is one of the wild vegetables that has largely disappeared from the modern European diet, but that the culinary revival movement has been rediscovering. The forced sea kale, blanched under pots or boxes to exclude the light and produce the tender pale shoots that were considered a delicacy in the 18th century, is a specifically British culinary tradition that is currently being revived by chefs interested in native British vegetables. Chapter 4. The legumes, the protein foundation of the medieval diet, and the specific varieties that have disappeared. The pea is older than civilization, not the garden pea of the modern freezer section. The small, sweet, bright green sphere that the industrial food system has optimized for frozen preservation, and that the modern cook deploys primarily as a convenient side dish or a garnish, the ancestral pea. The Pisum sativum that the earliest agricultural communities of the Fertile Crescent domesticated alongside wheat and barley approximately 10,000 years ago, that spread westward through Europe with the Neolithic agricultural expansion, and that arrived in Britain and northwestern Europe in a form that was the dietary staple of the majority of the population for the subsequent millennia. The pea that arrived in medieval Europe was not the sweet pea of the modern variety. It was the field pea, a harder, less sweet, more starchy variety that was grown primarily for drying rather than for eating fresh, and that was the primary protein source of the majority of the medieval population, for the simple reason that the majority of the medieval population could not afford to eat meat regularly and needed protein from somewhere. The distinction between the dried pea and the fresh pea in the medieval diet was the distinction between the staple and the luxury. The dried pea, the pea harvested when fully mature, allowed to dry in the pod, threshed out, and stored in sacks or barrels, was the food that the peasant household depended on through the winter and early spring the protein component of the pottage that was the everyday meal. The fresh pea, the pea harvested young, and eaten immediately before the sugars converted to starch and the texture softened, was the seasonal delicacy of the summer garden, eaten during the brief window when the fresh peas were available and valued precisely because of its contrast with the dried version that was the year-round staple. The field pea varieties that the medieval farmer grew were significantly different from the modern garden pea in appearance, flavor, and cultivation requirements. The medieval field pea was typically grown as a mixed crop with oats or barley. The legume cereal mixture called dredge in English, that combined the nitrogen-fixing benefit of the legume with the structural support of the cereal for the pea's climbing habit, and produced a combined harvest that was threshed together and used together in the pottage pot. The specific varieties, the blue pea, the hasting pea, the gray pea, were selected for their ability to dry hard and store well, rather than for the sweetness and tenderness that the modern variety selection has prioritized. The flavor of the dried medieval field pea, reconstituted by the hours of slow cooking that the pottage preparation required, was earthy, starchy, and substantially more complex than the flavor of the modern frozen pea. The slow cooking transformed the dried pea into the thick, porridge-like consistency that the pottage required, the individual peas eventually losing their structure and merging into the general mass of the stew, providing the protein and the substance that the meal needed, without the specific texture of the individual pea being the point of the exercise. The bean, and here we need to specify, because the word bean in the medieval context referred primarily to the field bean, Vitia faba, rather than to the range of beans that the modern cook has available, was the other great legume of the medieval diet, and its position in the medieval food hierarchy was if anything lower than the peas, which is saying something given what we have already established about the pea's association with the dietary floor. The field bean, the broad bean in its ancestral unimproved form, was the bean of the medieval world, and it was grown in vast quantities across the agricultural landscapes of medieval Europe in the specific role of the three field rotations, spring planting. The field bean was planted in the spring field as both a food crop and a green manure, its root nodules fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere in quantities that measurably improved the soil fertility for the subsequent cereal crop. And its dual role as food and soil improvement made it one of the most economically important crops in the medieval rotation system, even though its specific flavor and texture made it one of the less popular items in the medieval diet. The broad bean of the medieval period was a different variety from the broad beans that the modern cook uses. The large, pale green, buttery broad bean of the modern kitchen garden was the product of the selective breeding of later centuries that selected for larger, more tender seeds and a less strongly flavored pod. The medieval field bean was smaller, harder, darker in color, and more strongly flavored. The specific flavor that the modern cook might describe as earthy or beany in an assertive way that requires either long cooking or robust seasoning to manage. The specific problem of the field bean, the problem that the medieval dietary literature addresses with some concern, was its reputation for producing intestinal gas in quantities that the medieval social environment, with its close quarters and its limited ventilation, found impossible to ignore. The flatulence-producing compounds in beans, the oligosaccharide sugars that the human digestive system cannot break down, but that the intestinal bacteria address with enthusiasm, were as present in the medieval field bean as in its modern descendants, and the medieval dietary literature's consistent warnings about the consequences of bean consumption reflect both the biological reality of the bean's digestive effects and the social reality of a world in which those effects were experienced in communal sleeping spaces and communal working environments. The specific medieval remedies for the bean's digestive consequences are documented in the dietary treatises and the herbal literature of the period, with the matter-of-fact practicality of people addressing a real and recurring problem: the caraway seeds that could be added to the bean pottage, the savory herb whose name in several European languages translates as bean herb because of its specific association with exactly this culinary application, the fennel seeds and the cumin that the more elaborate kitchen added to the bean dishes. These were not merely flavoring agents. They were, in the medieval understanding, medicinal interventions addressing the specific humoral imbalance that the bean's cold and moist nature produced in the digestive system. The lentil, lens culinaris, occupies a smaller but interesting place in the medieval vegetable story because its presence in the medieval diet varied significantly by region in ways that reflect both the geographical range of its cultivation and the specific social associations that different food cultures attach to it. In the Mediterranean regions of Europe, southern France, Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, the lentil was a common and accepted food at all social levels, appearing in monastery records, in the recipe, collections of the elite kitchen, and in the simple meals of the peasant household, with the democratic indifference of a food that the culture had not decided to stigmatize. In Northern Europe, the lentil was less common and more associated with the specifically austere and penitential contexts of monastic fasting practice, its appearance in the English and German dietary records being primarily in the context of the Lenten diet and the fasting regimes of the religious communities, rather than in the everyday secular diet. The specific association of the lentil with the biblical story of Esau selling his birthright for a pot of lentil stew, the mess of pottage that represented the ultimate bad bargain, gave the lentil in the Northern European Christian tradition a specific symbolic weight that the Mediterranean tradition's more pragmatic relationship with the vegetable didn't carry. The vetch, Vitia sativa, was the legume that the modern food culture has most completely forgotten, and its forgotten status is partly explained by the specific role it occupied in the medieval food system, the food of absolute last resort, the crop that was primarily grown as animal fodder, but that the human population consumed in times of severe shortage when nothing better was available. The vetch was not a food that anyone chose when alternatives existed, and the medieval dietary literature's references to vetch consumption are consistently framed in terms of scarcity and desperation rather than of culinary preference. But the vetch was there, grown on the field margins and in the fodder crops, available as the backup protein source when the peas and beans of the regular crop had been exhausted, and its presence in the agricultural system was the agricultural equivalent of the emergency reserve, not used in normal times, but genuinely important in the abnormal times that the medieval climate and the medieval agricultural system produced with unsettling frequency. The chickpea, Cicer arietinum, appears in the medieval record primarily in the Mediterranean regions, where the continuity of the classical Roman agricultural tradition had maintained its cultivation through the early medieval period, and where the Moorish agricultural knowledge that the Iberian Peninsula absorbed through the Islamic presence added varieties and cultivation techniques that the Northern European tradition lacked. The chickpea was a standard ingredient in the Spanish and Southern French medieval kitchen in ways that it was not in England or Germany, and its absence from the Northern European medieval diet was not the absence of an undiscovered food, but the absence of a food that the climate didn't support and the trade networks didn't import in quantities sufficient to make it a regular dietary component. The specific nutritional importance of the legumes in the medieval diet is worth pausing on, because the modern food culture's relative neglect of dried legumes as a protein source makes it easy to underestimate how central they were to the medieval dietary system. The medieval peasant, who ate pottage twice a day, the morning pottage and the evening pottage that were the standard meals of the period, was eating a diet in which the legumes provided the majority of the protein that the body required. The meat that the modern Western diet treats as the normal protein source was, for the medieval majority, a seasonal luxury rather than a daily reality. The protein adequacy of the legume-based diet, its ability to provide the essential amino acids that the body requires, was not understood in the biochemical terms that modern nutrition uses, but the medieval dietary tradition had arrived empirically at the combination of legumes and cereals that the modern nutrition knows as protein complementation. The combination of the methionine-rich cereals with the lysine-rich legumes that together provide the complete amino acid profile that neither provides alone. The peas and bread combination of the medieval meal was doing what the rice and beans combination of multiple contemporary food cultures does, providing complete protein from plant sources through the accumulated empirical wisdom of a dietary tradition that had been optimizing for survival for millennia. Chapter 5. The alliums, onions, leeks, and garlic in medieval cuisine, and why they were more important than you think. Everything smelled of onions. This is not an exaggeration. The medieval kitchen's relationship with the allium family, the onions, the leeks, the garlic, the shallots, the chives that were the flavoring foundation of virtually every savory preparation in the medieval culinary tradition, was a relationship of comprehensive, daily, uncritical dependence, and the consequence for the sensory environment of the medieval household was that the smell of cooked alliums was as constant a feature of the domestic atmosphere as the smell of the wood smoke and the animal that we have discussed in other contexts. The onion, Allium cepa, was the most important single vegetable in the medieval diet across all social levels, which is a remarkable statement when you consider how many vegetables the medieval garden contained and how diverse the medieval diet could be in its better supplied moments. The onion appeared in every recipe collection of the period, in the earliest English, French, and German cookbooks, in the monastery accounts, in the household management literature, in the agricultural treatises. Everywhere that the medieval record addressed the subject of food, the onion was present. The specific varieties of onion grown in the medieval garden were not identical to the modern varieties, but the diversity was real. The white onion, the yellow onion, the red onion, the various forms that the selective cultivation of centuries had produced from the ancestral allium stock were all present in the medieval garden, with the specific varieties selected for their flavor, their storage life, their yield, and the specific culinary applications for which each was considered best. The storage onion, the variety selected for its ability to dry hard and keep through the winter, was the most valuable form, because the onion's role in the winter diet was as important as its role in the summer fresh form. The strings of drying onions hanging in the kitchen or the storage room were not decoration. They were the winter's flavoring supply, the specific ingredient without which the pottage tasted of nothing, and the salt meat tasted of only salt, and their adequacy or inadequacy reflected directly in the quality of the household's winter eating. The humoral theory's classification of the onion was complex and somewhat contradictory. The onion was simultaneously valued as a warming, stimulating food that counteracted the cold and moisture of the winter season, and suspected as a coarse, wind-producing food inappropriate for the delicate constitutions of the upper social orders. The medieval dietary literature for the aristocratic and wealthy classes sometimes recommended reducing onion consumption or using the more refined allium forms, the shallot, the leek, in preference to the raw onion whose effects on the breath and the digestive system the socially aspirant eater was advised to manage carefully. This social hierarchy of the alliums, with raw onion at the bottom, associated with the peasant's crude constitution, and the milder, more refined forms at the top, was one of the many ways that the medieval food culture used specific vegetables to communicate and reinforce social distinction. The great lord who ate shallots instead of onions was not merely making a culinary preference. He was making a social statement about the refinement of his constitution and the appropriateness of his diet to his elevated station. The leek, Allium ampuloprasum, occupied a special position in the medieval diet that the modern food culture has not maintained, and understanding the leek's medieval importance requires setting aside the modern tendency to treat it as a mild-flavored supporting actor in the soup pot and recognizing it instead as one of the most nutritionally and culinarily significant vegetables in the medieval repertoire. The leek was the vegetable most closely associated with the cultivation of the medieval Welsh and Celtic traditions. The association of Wales with the leek predates the national symbol status that it has held since at least the late medieval period, and probably reflects the genuine importance of leek cultivation in the Celtic agricultural traditions of the British Isles. The leek's specific cultivation requirements, its tolerance of the cool, moist conditions of the British and Northern European climate, its ability to be grown through the winter months and harvested as needed, its long growing season that made it available in the garden when many other vegetables had finished, made it particularly well suited to the specific agricultural conditions of northwestern Europe. The medieval leek was a larger, more robustly flavored plant than the modern commercial leek, selected for hardiness and yield rather than for the mild, tender flavor that the modern market prefers. It was planted more densely, grown in conditions that the modern grower would consider under-supported, and harvested across a longer season, from the late summer through the winter and into the early spring, in a continuous harvest that made it one of the most reliably available vegetables in the medieval kitchen garden calendar. The leek soup, the potage of leeks, the leek pottage, appears in the earliest English recipe collections as a standard everyday preparation, and its frequency in the medieval record reflects the frequency with which leeks appeared in the actual medieval diet. The leek pottage was the meal that the monastery served on fast days when the meat was forbidden, and the vegetable preparations had to carry the full weight of the meal, and its appearance in the elaborate written-down recipes of the monastery kitchen indicates that it was not merely a convenience food, but a preparation that the skilled medieval cook took seriously. The garlic, Allium sativum, was the third great allium of the medieval garden, and its role in the medieval diet was both more central and more contested than the modern food culture's straightforward acceptance of it as a flavoring ingredient might suggest. The garlic's flavor intensity, its medicinal reputation in the humoral tradition, and the specific social associations that its smell carried in the medieval social hierarchy all contributed to a relationship with the vegetable that was more complicated than simple acceptance or rejection. The humoral tradition's assessment of garlic was enthusiastically positive for the working population and more cautious for the social elite. Garlic was classified as hot and dry in the 4th degree, the most extreme end of the humoral temperature scale, which made it the specific corrective for the cold and moist conditions of the winter season, of the elderly person whose constitution was naturally cold and moist, of the agricultural laborer whose physical work in damp conditions required the internal warming that the garlic's extreme heat provided. The working person who ate garlic every day in the winter was, in the medieval medical understanding, making a sensible dietary health decision. The social elite, however, were advised to consume garlic with extreme caution, if at all. The hot, dry nature that made garlic beneficial for the cold, moist constitution of the working person was considered excessive and potentially harmful for the naturally warm, active constitution of the person whose high-quality diet and comfortable lifestyle had already provided sufficient internal heat. The smell of garlic on the breath, the specific persistent allium sulfur compounds that the body excretes through the lungs after garlic consumption, was also considered socially inappropriate at the upper levels of society, where the refinement of the person was expected to extend to the refinement of their breath. This social dimension of garlic consumption, its association with the peasant, the manual laborer, the person whose physical constitution required crude, strong foods, was expressed in the medieval literature with the directness that the medieval social hierarchy was comfortable using about food and class. The person who smelled of garlic was a person who ate like a peasant, and the person who ate like a peasant was, in the medieval social understanding, signaling something about their place in the social order that the garlic smell made visible, or rather olfactorily evident, to everyone around them. The chive, Allium schoenopressum, was the small mild allium of the medieval garden, grown primarily for its thin green leaves that provided the delicate onion flavor that the larger allium's intensity sometimes overwhelmed. The chive appears in the medieval record primarily in the context of the more refined preparations of the monastery and the great household kitchen, where the skill of the cook was partly demonstrated by the subtlety of the flavoring rather than by the straightforward intensity of the peasant kitchen's allium use. The wild garlic, Allium ursinum, was the allium that the medieval forager gathered from the woodland floor in spring, where it grew in the specific damp, shaded conditions of the deciduous woodland in quantities that the medieval forest management left available for harvest. The wild garlic's season, the brief spring window when the leaves were young, tender, and at their most flavorfully intense, made it a specifically seasonal ingredient whose value was partly its association with the spring renewal after the winter's limited diet. The smell of wild garlic in the medieval woodland in April, the specific penetrating allium scent that the crushed leaves release and that the spring wind carries through the forest, was a sensory signal of the season change that the medieval person interpreted as meaningfully as the returning birdsong and the first flowers. The wild garlic was the forest's announcement that winter was truly over and that the fresh food season had begun. And the foraging of wild garlic in spring was one of the specific seasonal food gathering practices that connected the medieval person to the natural calendar in ways that the modern supermarket's year-round availability has entirely severed. Chapter 6. The greens, the leafy vegetables that fed the medieval world and mostly vanished. You need to eat your greens. The medieval person did not need to be told this. The eating of greens, the cooked or raw leaves of the various leafy vegetables that the garden and the hedgerow and the woodland produced, was not the nutritional advice of the contemporary public health establishment. It was the dietary default of the majority of the medieval population, the food that the kitchen garden produced in abundance during the growing season, and that the winter garden's hardiest plants continued to provide in diminished but genuine quantities through the cold months. The greens of the medieval garden were not primarily the salad greens of the modern food culture. The tender lettuce leaves, the baby spinach, the rocket that the contemporary salad bowl contains. The medieval greens were cooked, in the great majority of their uses, because the medieval dietary tradition was deeply suspicious of raw food in quantities, and because the cooking of greens, the brief boiling that the medieval recipe invariably prescribes, was the standard preparation for the vegetables whose raw form the medieval stomach was considered unable to safely process. The spinach, Spinacia oleracea, appears in the medieval record as a relatively recent arrival to the European garden, having been introduced from Persia through the Islamic world to Spain, and then spreading slowly northward through Europe during the medieval period. The spinach that appears in the 14th and 15th century recipe collections of the more elaborate European kitchens was a novelty with a specific association with the Islamic culinary tradition that had transmitted it, and its presence in the medieval kitchen was uneven. Common in the Mediterranean kitchens that had direct contact with the Islamic culinary world, rare in the Northern European kitchens that were further from the point of introduction. The Northern European greens tradition was organized around the coleworts and the pot herbs that we have already discussed, supplemented by the specific wild greens that the hedgerow and the woodland provided in the spring season. The wild plants that the medieval forager gathered in spring, the nettles, the ground elder, the chickweed, the sorrel, the dandelion, were not the foods of desperation that the modern urban sensibility might assume. They were the specific seasonal foods of the spring diet, valued for their freshness after the winter's preserved and stored diet, and for the specific flavors and nutritional properties that each provided. The nettle, Urtica dioica, was one of the most important wild greens of the medieval spring diet, and its use as a food in the medieval period was considerably more widespread and more respectable than its current status as a curiosity of the foraging revival would suggest. The young nettle tops of spring, before the plant has flowered and before the leaves have become too tough and too strongly flavored, are genuinely good as a cooked green with a flavor that the descriptions compare to spinach with more complexity and with a nutritional profile that the modern analysis confirms as impressive. The sting of the fresh nettle, the formic acid and histamine that the plant's surface hairs deliver, with the specific efficiency of a plant that has evolved a very effective deterrent system, was managed in the medieval kitchen by the simple expedient of cooking, which denatures the stinging compounds and renders the plant completely safe to handle and eat. The technique of gathering nettles with gloves or with a folded piece of cloth was standard medieval foraging knowledge, and the specific instruction in how to handle nettles safely appears in the household management literature of the period with the matter-of-fact tone of an instruction so basic it barely needs stating. The ground elder, Egopodium podagraria, is the wild green that the medieval garden management literature addresses with the specific resigned exasperation of everyone who has ever tried to grow other things in a garden where ground elder has established itself. Ground elder is one of the most aggressively spreading garden weeds in the British and Northern European garden tradition, capable of overwhelming cultivated plants through the sheer persistence of its underground rhizome system and the speed with which it colonizes disturbed ground. The medieval response to this weed, a response that the modern gardener, who typically treats it as a pure nuisance to be eliminated, has largely forgotten, was to eat it. The ground elder was originally introduced to Britain as a cultivated vegetable by the Romans, who valued its young spring leaves as a cooked green, and whose practice of cultivating it in the kitchen garden was the origin of the plant's subsequent escape into the wild, and its subsequent establishment as one of the most persistent garden weeds in the country. The medieval kitchen garden's management of ground elder was therefore the management of a plant that was simultaneously a useful vegetable and a potentially invasive presence, and the solution was the pragmatic one. Harvest the young leaves regularly enough to keep the plant from overwhelming the garden while using the harvested leaves in the kitchen. The sorrel, Rumex acetosa, was the sharp, acidic green of the medieval garden that provided the specific sour flavor that the medieval cook used in ways that the modern cook has largely replaced with vinegar and citrus. Sorrel's sourness comes from the oxalic acid in its leaves, the same compound that gives rhubarb its characteristic flavor, and the medieval kitchen used sorrel's acidity as a cooking ingredient in the acidic sauces that the humoral tradition recommended for cutting the richness of the fat meats and the heavy preparations that the feast day table featured. The sorrel sauce, the green sauce of sorrel leaves pounded with other herbs and vinegar, the forerunner of the green sauces that various European national cuisines have maintained in different forms, was one of the standard medieval accompaniments to fish and to the fatty meats, and its appearance in the earliest English recipe collections with the frequency of a standard kitchen preparation reflects the genuine importance of sorrel as a culinary ingredient rather than its status as a wild food curiosity. The good King Henry, Chenopodium bonus henricus, is one of the medieval vegetables that has most completely disappeared from the modern diet, and it is a disappearance that the revival movement has been attempting to reverse with some success in specialist circles. Good King Henry was a perennial pot herb grown in the kitchen garden specifically as a source of spring greens, its broad, spear-shaped leaves emerging in early spring before most other garden plants had begun to grow, providing the first significant green food of the new season. The plant's name, in various European languages, Bon Henri in French, Guter Heinrich in German, Good King Henry in English, all reflect a similar pattern of medieval naming that is less clearly understood than one might hope, the connection to any specific King Henry being disputed by the historians of the vegetable. What is clear is that the plant was a recognized and valued kitchen garden plant throughout the medieval period across the whole of Northern Europe, and that its disappearance from the modern garden coincided with the development of better yielding, more uniform, more commercially suited alternatives that the agricultural modernization of the 19th and 20th centuries produced. Good King Henry is genuinely easy to grow, genuinely productive in the spring season when few other vegetables are available, and genuinely good to eat. The young leaves in salads, the older leaves cooked as a spinach substitute, the young shoots blanched like asparagus in the spring, the seeds ground as a grain substitute in lean times. The plant provides multiple food products from a single perennial planting, requires minimal cultivation once established, and improves in productivity over the years as the root system develops. It is, in short, the kind of low-maintenance, multi-use perennial vegetable that the current interest in permaculture and low-input food production would seem ideally suited to appreciate. The dandelion, Taraxacum officinale, occupied a position in the medieval food culture that was simultaneously more valued and more complicated than its modern status as the weed of the lawn would suggest. The dandelion's leaves were a spring green, gathered from the meadow and the garden margin, valued for the specific bitterness that the medieval taste aesthetic accepted and even valued as the sign of the plant's medicinal efficacy. The bitter flavor in the humoral tradition being associated with the opening and cleansing properties that the spring diet was supposed to provide after the winter's heavy, stored foods. The dandelion root was used as a coffee substitute and as a medicinal preparation for the liver conditions that the humoral tradition associated with excess bile. The dandelion flower was used in the wine preparations that the medieval household made from whatever fermenting ingredients the season provided. The dandelion in the medieval kitchen was a food plant in all its parts, used through its entire growing season for different preparations, and the modern reduction of it to a lawnweed. To be chemically eliminated represents a significant narrowing of the relationship between the human kitchen and this particular plant. Chapter 7. The herbs, where seasoning ended and medicine began. And why? The medieval cook didn't care about the difference. The herb garden was the kitchen and the pharmacy. In the modern food culture, the distinction between herbs and medicine is clear and categorical. Herbs are the flavoring agents that the cook adds to food for their flavor contribution, and medicine is the pharmaceutical preparation that the doctor prescribes for the treatment of specific conditions. The medieval mind did not make this distinction with the same confidence, because the medieval understanding of food and health was organized around the humoral theory that made the distinction between culinary and medicinal effect conceptually impossible. Every food affected the balance of the humors, and every medicinal plant affected the balance of the humors, and the difference between a herb added to the pottage for its flavor and a herb added to the pottage for its medicinal effect was a difference of degree rather than of kind. The herb garden of the medieval monastery, or the great household, was therefore simultaneously the kitchen garden's herb section and the pharmacy's raw material supply, and the same plants appeared in both the recipe collections and the herbal medical texts, because the same plants were genuinely being used for both purposes by the same people in the same institutions. The lovage, Levisticum officinale, is the first of the medieval culinary herbs that the modern cook is most likely to be entirely unfamiliar with, and its unfamiliarity is inversely proportional to its importance in the medieval kitchen. Lovage was one of the most important flavoring herbs of the medieval kitchen tradition across the whole of Europe, appearing in virtually every medieval recipe collection that addresses savory cooking, used as a flavoring for the meat preparations and the pottages and the sauces of both the everyday and the feast day kitchen. The flavor of lovage is intense, a powerful, complex combination of celery, parsley, and something that the descriptions struggle to fully capture, with a specific warmth and depth that the milder modern celery herb lacks. The lovage leaf in the pottage was providing the flavor that the modern cook might achieve with a combination of celery, parsley, and a stronger seasoning, and the medieval cooks reach for lovage as the standard flavoring for savory preparations reflects both the plant's availability in the kitchen garden and its genuine culinary effectiveness. The lovage's disappearance from the modern Western kitchen. It is still used in the cuisines of Eastern Europe, particularly in Romania and Bulgaria, where the continuity of the medieval herb garden tradition has been less disrupted than in Western Europe, is partly explained by the development of new flavoring options in the early modern period, the arrival of the tomato from the Americas, and its gradual adoption as the basis of the sauce tradition that the Italian kitchen developed, the increasing availability of pepper and other imported spices, the development of more refined celery varieties that provided some of Lovage's flavor in a milder, more controllable form. All of these contributed to the reduction of Lovage's culinary importance in the kitchens of Western Europe. The costmary, Tanacatum balsamita, also called alacost or Bible leaf, was another medieval herb that the modern cook is unlikely to recognize, and its historical importance is considerably greater than its current obscurity suggests. Costmary was grown throughout the medieval period as both a culinary and medicinal herb. Its large, fragrant leaves used in the flavoring of ale before the hop became standard, the name alacost reflecting this specific use, and in the cooking of meat preparations, where its complex, minty balsamic flavor was considered particularly effective for cutting the richness of the fat meats. The use of costmary in ale as one of the Groot herbs, the herbs that flavored ale before hops, established their dominance in the brewing tradition. Places costmary at the intersection of the brewing, culinary, and medicinal herb traditions that the medieval garden maintained. The transition from the Groot ales, flavored with combinations of herbs including costmary, yarrow, sweet gale, and various other local plants, to the hopped ales that gradually became standard from the 14th century. Onward was one of the significant flavor transitions of the medieval period, and it contributed to the declining importance of several herbs whose primary use had been in the ale brewing that the hop displaced. The savory, Saturasia hortensis, summer savory, and Saturaja montana, winter savory, was the medieval cook's standard seasoning herb in ways that the modern cook's relationship with thyme and oregano approximates but doesn't quite match. The savory appeared so consistently in the medieval recipe collections, especially in combination with legumes, that the association between savory and beans was formalized in the German language as Bohnenkraut, literally bean herb, a name that precisely captures the specific culinary role that the medieval tradition had assigned to the plant. The flavor of savory, peppery, aromatic, slightly resinous, with a warmth that the dried herb concentrates into an intensity that requires careful use, was familiar to every medieval cook and unfamiliar to the great majority of modern Western cooks who have not specifically sought it out. The savory's combination of flavor and the specific digestive properties that the humoral tradition attributed to it, the ability to counteract the flatulence-producing effects of the legumes, based on the observation that beans cooked with savory produced less digestive disturbance than beans cooked without it, made it the specific companion to the legume pottage that the medieval kitchen tradition embedded so thoroughly that the association persisted in the German language long after the cultivation of savory had declined in importance. The Alexanders, Smyrnium olisatrum, was the medieval version of celery, the large, robust, strongly flavored umbelliferous herb that the monastic and kitchen gardens grew as the primary source of the celery flavor before the development of the modern celery plant. Alexander's was a larger, more vigorous plant than the modern celery, with a more powerful flavor and a darker green color, and it was used in all the ways that the modern cook uses celery, as a flavoring for soups and stews, as a vegetable in its own right, as a garnish and a salad ingredient in its young, tender form. The Alexanders disappeared from the mainstream European kitchen with the development and spread of the cultivated celery varieties that the 17th century Italian gardening tradition produced, and that gradually replaced the Alexanders in the kitchen gardens of Western Europe through the 17th and 18th centuries. The modern celery is milder, more uniform, more commercially suited to large-scale cultivation than the Alexanders, and the transition from the stronger flavored medieval herb to the milder modern vegetable is one of the many examples of the general flavor moderating trend that the agricultural modernization of the past 3 centuries has produced in European food plants. The Alexander's survives today as a wild plant on the cliff tops and coastal paths of the British Isles, where the original garden escapes established themselves in the specific habitat that its Mediterranean origin had prepared it for, and where the foraging revival has rediscovered it as one of the more interesting wild foods of the spring British coast. The Alexander's, gathered from a Dorset or Pembrokeshire clifftop in March, is the same plant that the medieval cook grew in the kitchen garden, and that the Roman armies had carried north from the Mediterranean as one of the standard vegetables of the legionary diet. The marigold, Calendula officinalis, was a medieval garden plant whose role in the kitchen was considerably more central than the modern gardener's treatment of it as a purely ornamental or very occasionally medicinal plant would suggest. The marigold petals were used in the medieval kitchen as a flavoring and coloring agent, the specific golden orange color of the petals providing the visual effect that the modern cook achieves with saffron or turmeric at a fraction of the cost, and with a flavor contribution that the medieval cook valued for its mild, slightly bitter aromatic quality. The marigold pottage, the pottage colored and flavored with marigold petals, appears in the medieval recipe collections as a specific preparation, not a flavored pottage that happened to include marigold, but a pottage defined by the marigold's contribution to its appearance and its flavor. The use of flower petals as cooking ingredients in the medieval kitchen was more widespread than the modern food culture's relatively narrow flower in salad convention acknowledges. And the marigold was among the most important of the culinary flowers because of the specific combination of coloring and flavoring capacity that made it the affordable saffron substitute for the kitchen that couldn't regularly obtain the more expensive spice. Chapter 8. The Preservation: How the Medieval Cook Stored and Preserved Vegetables Through Winter. The harvest is in. It is October. The garden is stripped of its summer growth. And the question that the medieval household now faces, the question that determined whether the winter would be adequately fed or genuinely hungry, is not what to grow or how to grow it, but how to make what was grown in the brief window of the growing season last through the 6 months of winter and early spring, when the garden would produce almost nothing, and the household's survival would depend on the adequacy of the stores laid in during these autumn weeks. The preservation of food was not a minor domestic skill in the medieval household. It was one of the most important technical competencies that the household required, practiced with the accumulated knowledge of generations, organized around the specific properties of the specific foods being preserved, and carried out with the urgency of people who understood that the quality of their preservation work in October would be directly reflected in the quality of their nutrition in February. The root cellar was the most fundamental preservation technology for the root vegetables, and its design reflected a genuine understanding of the physics of food preservation that the modern refrigerator has replaced, rather than improved upon in principle. The root cellar exploited the Earth's thermal mass, the specific property of the ground below a certain depth that it maintains a relatively constant temperature through the year, warmer than the winter air above, and cooler than the summer air above, to create a storage environment that extended the life of the root vegetables by keeping them cool enough to prevent the metabolic processes of deterioration while keeping them warm enough to prevent freezing. The specific design requirements of the effective root cellar were understood through the empirical knowledge of what worked and what didn't. The cellar that was too shallow lost the thermal buffering of the deep earth and experienced temperature fluctuations that damaged the stored vegetables. The cellar that was too damp encouraged the mold that spread from vegetable to vegetable with the patient thoroughness of an organism that had been making the most of injured root crops since long before humans started storing them. The cellar that allowed air circulation without excess moisture was the cellar that produced the stored root vegetables that would still be in acceptable condition in March. And the household whose root cellar was well designed and well managed had a genuine food security advantage over the household whose cellar was poorly designed or poorly managed. The specific storage arrangements within the root cellar reflected the accumulated wisdom of medieval food preservation. Practice. The root vegetables, parsnips, turnips, carrots, were stored in layers of sand or dry straw that prevented contact between individual roots and slowed the spread of any rot that began in one specimen to its neighbors. The individual roots were sorted before storage, the damaged and the diseased ones identified and removed before they could contaminate the sound ones, because the medieval understanding of food preservation was entirely correct in its empirical observation that the damaged specimen was the starting point of the spoilage that could eventually destroy the whole store. The onions and garlic were dried and stored differently from the root vegetables. The curing technique of allowing the harvested bulbs to dry in the air until the outer skins had hardened and the neck of the bulb had dried completely was the specific preparation that made long-term onion storage possible. The dried onion could be stored for months in a cool, dry space without significant deterioration, and the strings of dried onions that hung in the medieval kitchen or the storage room were the specific functional arrangement that allowed the stored onions to remain dry and well aerated while taking up minimal space. The leek was the vegetable that the medieval garden managed differently from the other alliums in terms of winter storage, because the leek's specific cultivation practice allowed it to remain in the ground through the winter rather than being harvested and stored. The leek could be left standing in the garden bed, protected by the soil around its roots, and harvested as needed through the winter months, the specific advantage of a vegetable that was its own storage container, keeping itself fresh in the ground and providing the fresh vegetable that the stored root vegetables and the dried legumes could not provide. This storage in the ground approach to the winter vegetable supply was one of the specific advantages of the cold hardy plants. The leeks, the kale, the parsnip, which also improved in flavor after frost, that the medieval garden managed as standing crops rather than stored harvests. The garden in winter was not empty. It was a reduced, frost-hardy version of its summer self, still providing food to the household that knew which plants to leave in the ground and how to harvest them in the frozen conditions that the winter garden presented. The pickling and fermentation of vegetables was the medieval preservation technology that modern food culture has been rediscovering through the fermentation revival of the past decade, and its importance in the medieval dietary system was considerable. The pickled or fermented vegetable provided not just the preservation of the vegetable's caloric content, but, in the case of fermented vegetables, a genuine improvement in certain nutritional properties. The fermentation of cabbage into sauerkraut, for example, maintains and in some respects increases the vitamin C content that cooking and other preservation methods reduce, and the lactic acid bacteria of the fermentation process produce additional nutritional compounds that the unfermented vegetable lacks. The medieval sauerkraut, or rather the pickled cabbage that the medieval German and Eastern European tradition produced under various regional names, the salt-fermented cabbage that was the standard winter preservation of the cabbage harvest across Northern and Eastern Europe, was one of the most important preserved foods in the medieval diet, precisely because of this vitamin C preservation property. The household that had adequately fermented its cabbage harvest was the household that had a winter supply of vitamin C at a period when fresh food was unavailable, and the prevention of the scurvy-like symptoms that winter vitamin C deficiency produced was a genuine health benefit of the fermentation tradition that the medieval practitioner understood in the practical terms of health outcomes rather than in the biochemical terms that modern nutrition provides. The specific technique of cabbage fermentation was simple in principle and required careful execution in practice. The shredded cabbage was salted in quantities that drew the water out of the plant cells through osmosis, the released liquid forming the brine that submerged the shredded cabbage, and the anaerobic conditions of the submerged vegetable in salt brine favored the lactic acid bacteria that conducted the fermentation while inhibiting the spoilage organisms that required oxygen. The salt concentration, the temperature of the storage environment, and the specific technique of keeping the fermenting cabbage submerged below the brine surface were the variables that the skilled medieval fermenter managed through the accumulated knowledge of what conditions produce the best results. The drying of herbs and some vegetables was the other major preservation technology of the medieval kitchen garden, and it was practiced with a thoroughness that the modern cook, who typically dries a small selection of herbs for flavoring, barely approximates. The medieval drying operation extended to the full range of herbs, and many of the vegetables whose flavor and medicinal properties were concentrated by drying. The onion, sliced and dried for storage, and for the specific flavor of the dried onion in winter preparations. The mushrooms, gathered from the autumn woodland and dried on strings or on frames near the fire for the concentrated flavor that the drying process produced. The legumes in their pods, dried on the plant before harvest, and then threshed and stored for the winter's protein supply. The herb drying was a specific, carefully managed operation in the households that took their herbal medicine and their culinary herb use seriously. The timing of the harvest for maximum medicinal or culinary potency was understood empirically. The herbs harvested just before flowering, when the essential oil content was at its highest, and dried quickly in the warmth and the moving air that prevented the mold that damp conditions would produce. The stored dried herbs in their labeled containers were the household's winter medicine chest and flavoring library simultaneously, and the care with which they were prepared and stored reflected the importance of both functions. The storage of the dried legumes, the peas and beans that were the winter's protein supply, required the specific management of the weevils and other grain insects that found the stored legumes as attractive as the humans who had put them there. The dried peas stored in a sealed container were peas that the weevil hadn't reached. The dried peas in a permeable sack, in a space that the grain weevil had access to, were peas in the process of becoming significantly less nutritious and significantly more mobile than their stored state was supposed to permit. The management of grain insects in stored legumes was a genuine agricultural and domestic management problem, whose solutions, the sealed containers, the specific storage locations, the periodic checking and turning of the stored legumes, were as important to the winter food supply as the quality of the harvest itself. Chapter 9. The Forgotten Flavors. What the medieval diet actually tasted. Like the pottage is ready. You have been smelling it for the past 2 hours. The slow, building smell of the morning's pottage as it developed from the initial addition of the grain and the water and the dried peas into the complex, layered smell of the finished preparation. The smell is not what you expected, not the bland, neutral smell of the gruel that the word pottage has come to imply in the modern imagination's processing of the medieval food tradition. Something more interesting than that. The medieval diet has been comprehensively misrepresented in the popular imagination as bland, repetitive, and unpleasant. And the misrepresentation comes from two specific errors that the historical record examined carefully corrects. The first error is the assumption that the medieval cook's limited access to ingredients meant a limited flavoring vocabulary, when in fact the medieval kitchen garden's herb diversity was greater than the modern herb garden's diversity by a considerable margin. The second error is the assumption that the medieval taste aesthetic was similar to the modern taste aesthetic, so that the foods that the modern palate would find challenging are the foods that the medieval palate found challenging too. The medieval taste aesthetic was organized around a different set of preferences from the modern one, and the differences are revealing. The medieval taste preference for the combination of sweet and savory in the same dish, the addition of honey or dried fruit to the meat preparation, the combination of the sharp sour of vinegar with the warmth of the spices in. The sauce was one of the defining characteristics of medieval cuisine that the modern Western palate, trained on the strict separation of sweet and savory courses, finds confusing. The medieval cook who added currants to the pork stew, who sweetened the fish preparation with honey, who combined the vinegar and the ginger in the sauce for the roasted bird, was not making an error. They were following the specific taste aesthetic of their tradition with the same confidence that the modern cook follows the taste aesthetic of theirs. The sourness that the medieval taste tradition valued was another point of difference from the modern palate's preferences. The verjuice, the juice of unripe grapes or unripe apples, the acidic liquid that the medieval cook used as the primary souring agent in the absence of the lemon juice, and the wine vinegar that the modern cook deploys, was a specific complex sourness that the medieval recipe collections treat as a standard kitchen ingredient. The sorrel sauce, the vinegar-based preparations, the fermented drinks, and the sour ales that the medieval kitchen produced all reflect a higher tolerance for and positive preference for sourness than the modern Western palate maintains. The bitterness that the medieval taste tradition accepted in the greens, the dandelion, the sorrel, the bitter herbs that the modern cook has largely replaced with milder alternatives through the selection pressure of commercial vegetable breeding, was another dimension of the medieval flavor aesthetic that the modern palate has largely departed from. The medieval acceptance of bitterness was both a culinary preference and a medical one. The bitter flavor in the humoral tradition was associated with the specific digestive and cleansing properties that the spring diet was supposed to provide, and the consumption of bitter greens was simultaneously a culinary choice and a medical one. The spicing of the medieval diet, the pepper, the ginger, the cinnamon, the cloves, the nutmeg, the various imported spices that the trade routes made available to those who could afford them, was concentrated in the upper levels of the medieval social hierarchy and was the most direct expression of the association between spice and status that the medieval food culture maintained with consistent explicitness. The spiced food was the expensive food. The expensive food was the food of the wealthy. The wealthy person's table was identified by its spicing in ways that the visual difference of the food and the olfactory difference of the room communicated to everyone present. But even the unspiced food of the poor household had a complexity of flavor that the modern reduction of the medieval peasant's diet to undifferentiated gray pottage consistently misses. The alliums, the onion and the leek, and the garlic that went into the poor household's pottage were providing a foundation of flavor that the bland base grain needed and that the herb additions from the kitchen garden built upon. The savory and the thyme and the lovage that the herbs represented in the garden provided flavoring whose intensity and complexity the modern cook, accustomed to the milder flavors of the commercially bred modern herb varieties, might find surprising. The specific flavor interaction of the medieval pottage, the combination of the earthy, starchy dried peas with the sharp alliums and the aromatic herbs, slow cooked until the flavors had merged and the separate ingredients had lost their individual identities in the general character of the finished dish, was not the same as the specific flavor interaction of the modern soup. The longer cooking time, the less refined ingredients, the more robust herbs, the absence of the tomato-based flavor foundation that has become standard in the Western soup tradition since the 17th century. All of these produced a flavor profile that was genuinely different from what the modern palate expects when it thinks about vegetable-based preparations. The ale that accompanied the medieval meal, and ale accompanied virtually every medieval meal at every social level, was itself a flavored preparation whose Groot herbs contributed to the meal's overall flavor experience in ways that the modern beer's hop-based bitterness approximates but doesn't replicate. The yarrow ale, the sweet gale ale, the costmary ale, the specific Groot combinations that different regional traditions use to flavor their ales, provided a flavor backdrop to the meal that the modern hop-flavored beer's different bitterness profile has replaced. And the specific flavor interaction between the Groot ale and the pottage was part of the medieval meal's overall sensory experience that no modern reconstruction can fully replicate. The cheese that appeared in the medieval diet at most social levels was a different product from the cheeses that the modern supermarket sells, and its relationship to the vegetables on the medieval table was closer than the modern meal's typical separation of the cheese course from the vegetable preparations would suggest. The fresh cheese, the soft, barely drained, tangy curd cheese that was the everyday dairy product of the medieval household, was consumed alongside the vegetable preparations and the bread, in a combination that the modern food culture separates into the distinct courses that the formal dinner structure has created. The bread that was the caloric foundation of the medieval diet, the dark, dense maslin or rye bread of the ordinary household, provided the background flavor against which the vegetables and the herbs and the alliums expressed themselves, and the specific combination of the dark bread's earthy, slightly sour flavor with the vegetable preparations of the medieval kitchen was a flavor combination that the bread's quality as an independently flavored food rather than a neutral delivery mechanism made possible and interesting in ways that the blander modern bread does not. The salt, the simple, irreplaceable salt that the medieval cook used as the primary preservation agent and the primary flavor amplifier, was a different product from the refined white salt of the modern kitchen in its mineral complexity, and the specific mineral flavors of the sea salt and the rock salt that the medieval cook used contributed to the flavor of the preserved vegetables and the salted preparations in ways that the refining process has removed from the modern equivalent. Chapter 10. The Agricultural Crisis. What happened when the system failed? The harvest has failed, not partially failed. Not the disappointing harvest of a year with difficult weather that produces less than the normal yield, but enough to feed the household through the winter with careful management. Failed. The rain came at the wrong time and stayed too long. The grain rotted in the standing, stalked before it could be harvested. The root vegetables drowned in the waterlogged soil. The legumes that were supposed to fix nitrogen and provide protein for the winter's pottage failed to set pods in the cold, wet summer that the plants experienced as a disaster and that the household that depended on them experienced as the beginning of a very bad year. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was the specific agricultural crisis that revealed the specific vulnerabilities of the medieval agricultural system in ways that the subsequent centuries' recovery could not fully correct before the Black Death of 1347 demonstrated that famine was not the only catastrophic threat to the medieval population, but the Great Famine's specific mechanism, the sustained bad weather that failed the harvests of 7 successive years across the whole of Northern Europe, was a failure that the specific organization of the medieval agricultural system amplified in specific ways that the forgotten vegetables illuminate. The vulnerability was the narrowness of the crop base. The medieval agricultural system, for all its impressive diversity of kitchen garden vegetables and herbs, was built on a very narrow foundation of staple crops: the wheat, the rye, the barley, the oats, and the legumes that provided the caloric core of the diet. When the weather failed the grain harvest, the entire caloric foundation of the medieval diet failed simultaneously because the diversity of the kitchen garden's vegetables was the diversity of the supplement rather than the diversity of the foundation. The potato, which would eventually transform European food security by providing a caloric staple that thrived in the cool, wet conditions that devastated the grain harvest, was not available. The diverse range of root vegetables in the medieval kitchen garden, the parsnips, the turnips, the skirrets, the beets, were supplementary foods rather than caloric foundations, and their individual yields were insufficient to compensate for the grain harvest's failure in the quantities that the population's caloric needs required. The Great Famine's specific agricultural catastrophe began in the spring of 1315 with unusually heavy and persistent rain across northern Europe, England, France, the Low Countries, Germany, Scandinavia, that prevented the normal spring planting and waterlogged the fields that had been planted before the rains arrived. The summer of 1315 was cold and wet, the grain that had managed to establish itself growing poorly and failing to ripen before the autumn's early frosts. The harvest of 1315 was catastrophic across the entire affected region. Estimates of the harvest failure range from 25 to 50% below normal, and the food price increases that the shortage produced were immediate and severe. The 1316 growing season was worse. The 1317 season produced some improvement, raising hopes of recovery, before the 1318 and 1319 seasons returned to the pattern of failure. By the time the weather pattern finally broke in the early 1320s, the northern European population had experienced 7 years of intermittent harvest failure, extreme food price inflation, epidemic disease, exacerbated by the malnutrition that the food shortage had produced, and a demographic collapse whose scale the regional records document with the grim precision of administrators counting the living and the dead. The specific role of the vegetables in the famine response was the role of the inadequate backup when the main system failed. The turnips and the parsnips and the various root crops of the kitchen garden were harvested with the desperate thoroughness of people who needed every calorie available, the normally supplementary foods becoming the primary food source when the grain stores were exhausted. The wild plants, the nettles, the ground elder, the various hedgerow plants that the foraging tradition knew, and that the desperation of the famine made accessible in ways that the normal food supply had not required, were gathered with the same desperate thoroughness. The bark bread, the practice of grinding tree bark, particularly the inner bark of pine trees, into flour that was mixed with whatever grain flour remained and baked into a bread that provided bulk and some nutrition, but that the digestive system of people, already weakened by malnutrition, processed with great difficulty, appears in the famine records of the most severe regional crises as the specific food of last resort, the point at which the food system had failed so completely that the population was eating what the trees provided. The specific nutritional consequences of the Great Famine, the malnutrition-related diseases that the inadequate and unbalanced diet of the famine years produced in the surviving population, are visible in the skeletal record of the period and in the literary and medical records that document the specific conditions that the famine's dietary inadequacy produced. The swelling of the extremities that the protein deficiency of the famine diet produced. The night blindness that the vitamin A deficiency of a diet stripped of its normal vegetable and dairy components produced. The specific weakness and pallor that the iron and vitamin B deficiency of a diet reduced to minimal grain, and whatever wild plants could be found produced in people whose normal diet had provided these nutrients in adequate quantities. The agricultural recovery from the Great Famine, the specific changes in agricultural practice and crop management that the crisis motivated, is less well documented than the crisis itself, but the evidence suggests that the recovery involved both a return to the pre-famine agricultural patterns and some specific modifications that the famine's lessons had suggested. The expansion of the kitchen garden as a food security measure, the intensification of root vegetable cultivation in the specific recognition of their survival value in years when the grain harvest failed, the increased attention to the food preservation practices that extended the vegetable harvest through the lean months. All of these can be inferred from the agricultural records of the post-famine period. The specific lesson of the parsnip's importance in the famine years was a lesson about the relative stability of the root vegetable harvest compared to the grain harvest. The root vegetables, once established in the ground, were more tolerant of the wet conditions that devastated the grain, and the household whose kitchen garden contained an adequate quantity of parsnips and turnips was the household that ate something other than bark bread in the worst years of the famine. This lesson was not forgotten quickly, and the intensification of root vegetable cultivation in the kitchen gardens of the post-famine period reflects the specific experiential knowledge that the famine had produced about which foods provided genuine food security. The Black Death of 1347 arrived in a population that had not fully recovered from the Great Famine's demographic and agricultural damage, and its specific devastation of the European population, the estimates of mortality ranging from a third to a half of the total European population in the initial outbreak, produced the specific agricultural effects of an economy whose labor force had been catastrophically reduced. The shortage of agricultural labor that the Black Death produced changed the relationship between the lord and the peasant, between the cultivated land and the abandoned land, between the intensive kitchen garden cultivation and the less labor-intensive pastoral farming that the reduced population could maintain. The specific effect of the Black Death on the medieval vegetable tradition is one of the more interesting and less discussed dimensions of the post-plague agricultural adjustment. The labor-intensive kitchen garden cultivation, the hand weeding, the intensive bed preparation, the careful management of the diverse range of cultivated plants that the kitchen garden tradition required, was precisely the kind of agricultural activity that the labor shortage most severely constrained. The households that survived the plague needed to produce food with fewer hands, and the vegetables that survived the post-plague adjustment were the vegetables that required less labor per unit of food produced. The turnip and the kale, the relatively undemanding vegetables that could be broadcast sown in prepared ground and harvested with minimal subsequent management, were the vegetables that the labor-constrained post-plague household could maintain. The more demanding kitchen garden plants, the herbs that required regular harvesting and drying, the skirret that was difficult to harvest in bulk, the complex preparation vegetables that required extensive processing. Before eating, were the plants most likely to be reduced in cultivation in the households whose labor supply had been reduced by the plague's mortality. Chapter 11. The Revival, the contemporary movement to rediscover medieval vegetables, and what it has found. Someone is growing skirret, not in a museum garden, not in a historical recreation context, where the growing of forgotten vegetables is the explicit curatorial objective. In a kitchen garden in rural France, maintained by a market gardener who came across a reference to skirret in an agricultural history text, obtained seed from a specialist seed library in Belgium, grew the plant experimentally for 2 seasons, and discovered that it was genuinely delicious in ways that his contemporary vegetable repertoire did not include. This specific story, the gardener who encounters the forgotten vegetable through historical research, obtains seed through the specialist network that has preserved what the mainstream seed trade dropped, and discovers through growing and eating that the forgetting was a loss rather than an improvement, has been repeated hundreds of times across Europe and North America in the past 2 decades, and the cumulative effect of these individual discoveries is the beginning of a genuine revival of the medieval vegetable tradition that the agricultural modernization of the past 3 centuries had made to seem permanently lost. The contemporary revival of heritage and forgotten vegetables is happening in several overlapping contexts that together constitute a genuine movement, even if the participants in each context don't always recognize their connection to the others. The chef-driven context, the Michelin-starred and aspiration-level restaurants whose menus increasingly feature forgotten and heritage vegetables as the specific culinary territory that distinguishes the serious modern kitchen from the generic, has been important in raising the public profile of vegetables like the black carrot, the skirret, the various heritage kale varieties that appear on restaurant menus as novelties and as the evidence of the kitchen's historical and agricultural seriousness. The heritage seed movement, the network of seed libraries, seed banks, and heritage seed companies that have been preserving the genetic diversity of cultivated plant varieties that the commercial seed trade's consolidation around a small number of high-yielding, commercially optimized varieties was eliminating, has been the essential infrastructure of the revival, providing the genetic material without which no amount of culinary interest could actually produce the plants. The Garden Organic Heritage Seed Library in England, the Seed Savers Exchange in the United States, the national and regional seed libraries of France, Germany, and the Netherlands. These institutions have been the archivists of the vegetable diversity that the agricultural modernization was eliminating, and their catalogs are the inventory of what the revival has available to work with. The academic, historical, and archaeological research that has produced the detailed knowledge of what the medieval garden contained and how it was managed has been the intellectual foundation of the revival, providing the specific, documented knowledge about what was grown and how it was used that transforms the revival from mere nostalgia into genuine historical reconstruction. The work of food historians like Terence Scully and Constance Height on medieval recipe analysis, the archaeobotanical research that has identified the plant remains from medieval sites with increasing precision, the ethnobotanical work that has documented the survival of medieval vegetable varieties in the traditional agricultural communities of Europe. All of this has made it possible to understand what the medieval vegetable garden actually contained rather than guessing. The specific plants that the revival has been most successful in returning to cultivation and to the dinner table include some that are genuinely superior to their modern replacements in specific culinary applications, and some that are genuinely interesting as historical curiosities without being strong candidates for mainstream commercial cultivation. The black carrot, the deep purple-black carrot variety that was the standard medieval carrot color before the Dutch orange variety's commercial dominance, has been one of the revival's more commercially successful recoveries, and its commercial success has been built on genuinely attractive properties. The striking visual appearance of the deep purple root, the slightly different flavor profile from the orange carrot that the anthocyanin pigments contribute, and the specific health properties that the anthocyanin antioxidants provide, and that the marketing of heritage varieties has been effective in communicating to the health-conscious consumer. The skirret's revival has been slower and more limited for the reasons that explain its original disappearance: the difficulty of mechanical harvesting, the small individual root size that makes the preparation more labor-intensive than the modern cook typically tolerates. But the accounts of those who have grown and eaten it continue to be consistently positive in their assessment of its flavor, and the specific niche of the kitchen gardener who grows for flavor rather than for convenience is a niche that the skirret fits well. The heritage kale varieties, the tall, robust, large-leafed kales of the medieval tradition that survive in the traditional agricultural communities of Portugal, Italy, and the Celtic fringe of northwestern Europe, have been the revival's most commercially significant recovery, partly because the contemporary food culture's enthusiasm for kale as a nutritional superfood has provided a market context that the other forgotten vegetables lack. The discovery that the kale, the food culture had rediscovered, was a simplified, domesticated for convenience version of a much more diverse and interesting group of plants, has driven genuine commercial development of the heritage kale varieties, and the cavolo nero of the Tuscan tradition, and the couve tronchuda of the Portuguese tradition have both established themselves as commercial products in the premium vegetable market. The lovage revival has been more limited, but more consistent. The plant is easy to grow, genuinely productive, and genuinely useful in the kitchen in ways that the professional cook's discovery of it through the historical research has been translating into menu appearances with increasing frequency. The specific flavor that lovage provides, the deep, complex celery-parsley warmth combination that no modern herb quite replicates, is a genuine culinary asset that the professional cook who encounters it tends to find useful, and the amateur cook who encounters it through the kitchen garden tends to find genuinely interesting. The fermentation revival, the contemporary food culture's rediscovery of lactic acid fermentation as both a preservation technique and a flavor development tool, has been one of the more significant connections between the contemporary food movement and the medieval vegetable tradition. The sauerkraut, the lacto-fermented vegetables of the tradition that the industrial food culture had reduced to the commercial vinegar-pickled product that preserved the texture while eliminating the probiotic fermentation. This tradition has been revived in both the professional kitchen and the domestic one, and the revival has been substantially motivated by the historical research that documented how central the lacto-fermented vegetable was to the medieval dietary system, and how nutritionally important the fermentation tradition was for the winter vitamin C supply. The chefs who have been most successful in reviving the medieval vegetable tradition have been the chefs who have approached the historical research not as the literal recreation of medieval recipes, but as the recovery of principles and ingredients that can be applied in a contemporary culinary context. The medieval flavor combination of sweet and sharp and aromatic is a genuinely interesting culinary principle that the contemporary kitchen can apply with contemporary techniques to produce contemporary dishes that carry the historical DNA of the medieval tradition without attempting the impossible literal recreation of the medieval eating experience. The parsnip's rehabilitation in the contemporary British food culture is one of the more satisfying elements of the medieval vegetable revival. The vegetable that was the medieval diet's most important root crop, that was displaced by the potato and reduced to a minor side dish, has been genuinely rehabilitated in the contemporary British kitchen as a versatile, flavorful, and nutritionally interesting vegetable that the roast dinner, the soup, and the innovative chef's tasting menu have all found interesting and useful applications for. The parsnip has not recovered its pre-potato status, and the potato is not going anywhere, but the parsnip's revival is genuinely in progress. The broader lesson of the medieval vegetable revival is the lesson about the relationship between agricultural diversity and food security that the Great Famine illustrated from the direction of failure. The medieval garden's diversity, the range of vegetables that the household maintained, not because each was optimal by the standards of industrial efficiency, but because each contributed something specific to the household's food security in specific conditions, was a resilience strategy whose value the industrial agricultural system's optimization for yield and uniformity has traded away in exchange for efficiencies that are real and important, and that have nonetheless produced a food system more vulnerable in specific ways than the system they replaced. The forgotten vegetables of the medieval garden are not merely historical curiosities. They are genetic diversity, accumulated knowledge, and culinary possibility that the agricultural modernization of the past 3 centuries reduced without fully understanding what was being lost, and that the current moment's combination of food security concerns, culinary curiosity, and ecological awareness is beginning to recover. Not in the form of a romantic return to the medieval agricultural system, but in the form of a genuine reintegration of the medieval garden's diversity into the contemporary food system's repertoire. Chapter 12. The Monastery Garden. The institution that preserved what everyone else forgot. The monk is on his knees, not in prayer, or not only in prayer because in the Benedictine tradition, the garden work was itself a form of prayer. The ora et labora of the rule of Saint Benedict, making no sharp distinction between the kneeling at the altar and the kneeling in the vegetable bed. He is weeding with the specific systematic attention of someone who has been assigned this particular bed on this particular morning, and who understands that the weed left today is the weed that seeds next week, and that the vegetable bed seeded by the weed is the vegetable bed that feeds nobody in February. The monastery garden was the single most important institution in the preservation of the medieval vegetable knowledge that this script has been recovering, and understanding its specific role in the history of the forgotten vegetables requires understanding what the monastery was and what it was for in the specific agricultural and intellectual context of the medieval world. The Benedictine monastery, and it was primarily the Benedictine tradition and its reform movements that shaped the medieval garden tradition, was simultaneously a religious institution, an agricultural enterprise, an educational center, a hospital, and a library. The combination of these functions in a single institution that had the resources, the stability, and the intellectual capacity to document its practices was precisely the combination that produced the specific record of what was grown, how it was grown, and how it was used that the modern historian relies on when reconstructing the medieval vegetable tradition. The monastery had resources that the ordinary household lacked: the accumulated endowments of land, the donated produce, the institutional revenues from the various economic activities of the monastic community. All of these provided the monastery with a food production system that could afford to maintain variety for its own sake, to grow the plants that were interesting or medicinally valuable, even when their yield per unit of labor was lower than the most productive crops, and to experiment with new plants and new cultivation techniques, without the immediate survival pressure that the ordinary household's garden faced. The monastery also had the intellectual infrastructure to document what was grown. The monks who were responsible for the garden, the hortulanes, the monk whose specific responsibility was the monastery's garden management, were typically literate in Latin, connected to the wider monastic network through which plant material and knowledge circulated, and embedded in an institutional tradition that valued the recording of practical knowledge, alongside the theological learning that was the monastery's primary intellectual mission. The specific document that most directly reveals the monastery garden's contents and organization, the Plan of St. Gall that we mentioned in the first chapter, was not an isolated curiosity. It was the most elaborately preserved example of a type of document that the Carolingian Reform movement of the 8th and 9th centuries produced in considerable quantity. The architectural and agricultural planning documents that specified what a model Benedictine monastery should look like and what it should grow. The Capitulare de Villas, the list of plants that Charlemagne's agricultural reform program specified should be grown in the royal estates and implicitly recommended for the monastic establishments connected to the royal administration, is another document of this type, containing a plant list of approximately 70 species that serves as a snapshot of the cultivated plant knowledge of the Carolingian period. The Capitulare de Villas list is revealing in its combination of the familiar and the unfamiliar. The familiar plants, the onion, the garlic, the parsley, the fennel, the dill, appear alongside plants that the modern reader will not immediately recognize as garden vegetables: the fenugreek, the cumin, the costmary, the fennel flower, the rosemary, the rue, the southernwood. The combination of culinary, medicinal, and aromatic plants in a single list reflects the integrated function of the monastery garden as both kitchen garden and physic garden, the same beds serving both the cook and the infirmarian with the same plants used in both contexts. The physic garden, the garden of medicinal plants that the monastery's infirmary required, was where the monastery's preservation of the vegetable tradition intersected most directly with the intellectual tradition of the classical world. The herbal knowledge that the medieval monastery maintained was grounded in the classical texts, the De Materia Medica of Dioscorides, the Naturalis Historia of Pliny the Elder, the various compilations and summaries of the classical botanical tradition that the monastic scriptoria had copied and preserved through the intellectual disruptions of the early medieval period. The specific challenge that the monastery's maintenance of the classical botanical tradition created was the challenge of geographic mismatch. The plants that Dioscorides described were the plants of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the monastery that was trying to maintain and use this knowledge in the damp, cool conditions of northwestern Europe was working with plant material that had been described for a completely different climate. The monastery's practical solution to this challenge was one of the more interesting episodes in the history of botanical knowledge: the systematic identification of northern European plants that could substitute for the Mediterranean plants described in the classical texts, combined with the cultivation of Mediterranean plants in the monastery's sheltered, carefully managed garden environment. The hyssop, the rosemary, the lavender, the sage, the aromatic Mediterranean herbs that appear in the St. Gall plan, and the Capitulare de Villas were plants that required careful siting and management in the northern European climate, and the monastery's ability to maintain them reflected both the practical garden skill of the monastic community and the specific architectural features of the monastery garden that provided the sheltered, south-facing, well-drained conditions that the Mediterranean plants required. The physics garden's raised beds against the south-facing monastery wall were the specific microclimate technology that made the Mediterranean herb cultivation possible in a climate that would otherwise have killed them. The infirmarian monk, the monk whose responsibility was the monastery's medical care, both for the monks themselves and for the lay population that the monastery's hospital served, was one of the primary users of the physic garden's production, and the specific herbal knowledge that the infirmarian maintained was a combination of the classical textual tradition and the accumulated practical experience of the monastery's own medical practice. the infirmarian who used the wormwood from the physic garden to treat the intestinal parasites that the medieval diet and the medieval sanitation produced with depressing regularity, was using a plant whose specific anti-parasitic properties the classical texts had described, and that the practical experience of the monastery's medical work had confirmed. The monastery's role in the exchange of plant material across the wider monastic network was one of the most important mechanisms by which new plants and new varieties circulated through the medieval agricultural system. The monastic network, the connections between houses of the same order, the relationships between monasteries across the whole of Europe, the specific plant-focused correspondence that the exchange of useful plants motivated, was a distribution system for botanical knowledge and plant material that operated across the entire geographic range of the medieval monastic world. The specific mechanism of this exchange is documented in the monastic correspondence that has survived. The letters between abbots and infirmarians discussing the exchange of plant cuttings and seeds, the requests for specific plants that the recipient's local environment could not produce and that the sender's more favorable location could provide, the descriptions of new plants received, and their cultivation requirements, that the practical exchange of plant material produced alongside the theological and administrative correspondence that forms the bulk of the monastic letter collections. The Cistercian reform of the 12th century produced a specific intensification of the monastery's agricultural and garden practices that had a significant impact on the vegetable tradition. The Cistercian emphasis on agricultural self-sufficiency, the insistence that the monastery should feed itself from its own land rather than depending on the donations and the economic activities that the Benedictine tradition had relied on, drove a systematic development of the monastery's agricultural capacity that included significant expansion and intensification of the kitchen garden. The Cistercian monasteries, established deliberately in the remote and marginal landscapes that the Cistercian aesthetic of withdrawal from the world required, were also the monasteries that took on the most difficult agricultural reclamation projects. The draining of marshlands, the clearing of forest, the improvement of the poor soils of the marginal landscapes that the order had chosen for its settlements, the agricultural knowledge that the Cistercian network accumulated through the systematic reclamation of difficult land was the agricultural knowledge of people who had learned to grow food under the most challenging conditions that the medieval European landscape provided. And the plants that thrived in the Cistercian garden were plants that had been tested against the specific adversity of the reclaimed landscape. The dissolution of the monasteries, the specific historical event of the English Reformation's dissolution of the religious houses between 1536 and 1541, and the equivalent processes in other Protestant countries during the 16th century, was one of the more significant episodes in the history of the vegetable knowledge that the monastery had preserved, because the dissolution transferred the monastery's gardens and their accumulated knowledge from the institutional context that had maintained them continuously for centuries to the variable management of the new secular owners who acquired the monastery properties. Some of the medicinal and culinary plant knowledge that the monastery had maintained transferred successfully to the secular horticultural tradition of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Tudor herb garden, the physic gardens of the new universities, the gardens of the great houses that absorbed the monastery properties. But some of it was lost in the transition. The specific plants that the monastery had maintained for their specific institutional uses, the medicinal herbs of the infirmary, the liturgical plants of the cloister garden, the experimental plants of the more botanically adventurous communities, losing their institutional context and their institutional champion simultaneously. The monastery garden's legacy in the contemporary revival of forgotten vegetables is partly direct. The monasteries that survived the Reformation maintained their garden traditions through to the modern period, and the monastery gardens of southern Europe, of Ireland, and of the surviving contemplative communities elsewhere have been important sources of heritage plant material and botanical knowledge for the revival movement. The specific connection between the contemporary heritage vegetable movement and the monastery garden tradition is most visible in the French tradition of the potager de curé, the village priest's kitchen garden, which maintained elements of the monastery garden tradition in the secular context of the parish household, and which has been an important source of the heritage vegetable varieties that the French heritage gardening movement has been reviving. The monastery's specific contribution to the story of the forgotten vegetables of medieval agriculture is the contribution of the institution that had both the resources to maintain diversity and the intellectual infrastructure to document it. The vegetables that we know most about, the plants in the St. Gall plan, the herbs of the Capitulare de Villis, the medicinal plants of the monastery infirmary's documented practice, are the vegetables we know about because the monastery wrote them down. And the writing was both the monastery's specific contribution to the record and the reason that the recovery of the forgotten tradition is possible at all. The monk on his knees in the vegetable bed, weeding the skirret from the encroaching grass, was doing more than growing food. He was maintaining the living library of the cultivated plant tradition, keeping alive, through the daily work of cultivation, the specific plant knowledge that the agricultural modernization of later centuries would reduce, and that the contemporary revival is now attempting to recover. The skirret in the monastery bed is the same skirret in the heritage gardener's bed 700 years later. The knowledge that the monk maintained is the knowledge that the heritage seed library preserves. The chain of cultivation that connects the medieval garden to the contemporary revival is a chain with missing links and broken sections, but it is a chain that has not been entirely severed, and the recovery of what remains is the specific, practical work of the vegetable revival that this chapter's institution made possible, and that this script's final page celebrates. The garden was always worth kneeling in. Conclusion. The garden is quiet in November. The summer's abundance is over. The herbs have been cut back and dried. The root vegetables are in the cellar. The legumes are in their sacks and barrels. The kale and the leeks are standing in the frosted beds where they will remain through the winter, waiting for the household's need. The garden looks diminished compared to its summer self, but it is not empty. And the household that has managed it well through the growing season is a household that will eat adequately through the winter. Not abundantly, not with the variety of the summer garden's peak, but adequately, with the specific confidence of people who know what is in the cellar and the ground, and the herb storage, and who have done this calculation before. The vegetables that the medieval garden contained were not the vegetables of the modern supermarket. They were the specific plants that the specific agricultural tradition of the medieval period had identified through the accumulated empirical wisdom of generations as the best combination of productivity, storage, nutrition, and flavor, available within the material constraints of the pre-industrial garden. Some of them, the parsnip, the leek, the turnip, the field pea, survive in the modern diet in reduced but recognizable forms. Some of them, the skirret, the lovage, the good King Henry, the colewort in its medieval form, have been largely or entirely forgotten. And some of them, the specific varieties of the forgotten vegetables, the black carrot and the tall kale, and the field peas selected over centuries for their specific combination of flavor and storability, survive only in the specialist seed libraries and the heritage gardens where the conservation of genetic diversity has been maintained against the homogenizing pressure of the commercial seed trade. The people who grew these vegetables were not practicing a primitive, inadequate version of the food production that the modern agricultural system has perfected. They were practicing the specific agricultural tradition that they had, inherited, and that they understood with the intimate, detailed, practically exact knowledge of people whose survival depended on getting it right. The lovage that flavored the pottage, the dried peas that provided the winter protein, the kale that stood in the frozen garden providing vitamin C in January. These were the technologies of a dietary system that kept the majority of the European population alive through the conditions we have discussed, that failed when the conditions exceeded its tolerance, and that generated the specific, diverse, nutritionally complex food culture that the contemporary food revival is now recognizing as worth recovering. The skirret in the heritage garden, the black carrot on the restaurant menu, the good King Henry in the permaculture plot. These are not nostalgia. They are the recovery of the knowledge that the medieval garden accumulated through centuries of feeding people, and the recovery of the genetic diversity that the medieval agricultural tradition preserved through the specific cultivation of the specific plants that the specific conditions of the specific landscape produced at their best. The forgotten vegetables of the medieval garden are not entirely forgotten. Some of them are being remembered, and the garden that is being cultivated in their memory, the heritage plot, the restaurant kitchen garden, the specialist seed library's growing beds, is a garden whose plants are the direct descendants of the plants that the medieval farmer tended in the specific, intensive, hand-worked beds that this script began in. The parsnip in the modern roasting tin has been waiting 700 years for its rehabilitation. It was worth the wait.